This video was brought to you by Brilliant. In less than a month, Turkey is due to go to the polls to elect both its president and parliament. That means that incumbent President Erdogan, who's been in power for the best part of 2 decades now, is on the ballot. And while it might not go down too well in the West, his Islamist-tinged populism has proved genuinely popular in Turkey. However, due to his mishandling of the economy and cack-handed response to the earthquake, Erdogan is now well behind in the polls, and it's looking increasingly likely that the next election could be his last. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Erdogan, why he might lose the next election, who will succeed him, hint it's this dude, and what all of this would mean for Turkey's future. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, let's start off by briefly explaining why things don't look good for Erdogan. As we see it, there are basically 3 reasons why Erdogan might lose the upcoming election. His mishandling of the Turkish economy, his government's lackluster response to the earthquake earlier this year, and the fact that the opposition has finally got its act together. Let's start with the economy. Now, we've done a whole load of videos on the Turkish economy before, so go and watch them if you want a bit more context. But essentially, because Turkey's economy relies quite heavily on imports, Turkey's inflation rate has surged in the last 18 months or so. Now, usually, central banks hike rates to reduce this kind of inflation. But Erdogan thinks that this idea is a conspiracy advanced by the so-called interest rate lobby. And instead, he decided to cut interest rates and fire any central banker who dared to disagree with him. Accordingly, the central bank has cut interest rates from 19% in March of 2021 to 10.5% today. And as orthodox economists would have predicted, year-on-year inflation has jumped from about 20% to above 80% by the end of last year. And unofficial estimates suggest that it could actually be twice as high as the Turkish government is admitting in these stats. Regardless, this rapid rise in prices has eaten away at ordinary Turks' living standards and undermined Erdogan's economic record. His second issue, though, is his response to the earthquake. The earthquake that hit Turkey and Syria earlier in the year was truly devastating. It caused tens of thousands of deaths and displaced over 1 million people, with the UN estimating that the damage will exceed $100 billion in cost, over 10% of Turkey's GDP. Now, obviously, a natural disaster isn't anyone's fault, but Erdogan was criticised for both his response and for some of the policies that preceded the disaster. For instance, Turkey's search and rescue teams were slow to arrive and struggled to make a dent in the enormous amount of damage, and Erdogan's government were criticised for misspending natural disaster tax revenues, worth about $3.5 billion, and for failing to effectively enforce safety regulations brought into force after the 1999 earthquake. Now, this weak response to the earthquake and earlier policy mistakes have undermined Erdogan's reputation as an effective administrator and betrayed the implicit deal that he'd made with the Turkish public. That while he might be a bit autocratic, he's at least more effective than the dithering Democrats in the West. Or at least that's what he used to claim. The third reason Erdogan is now in trouble is that the usually fractious opposition parties have rallied around Kemal Kilicdaroglu, leader of Turkey's main opposition party, the CHP. That means that Kilicdaroglu is the presidential candidate for the 6-party anti-Erdogan opposition coalition. And the other big names in the coalition have all agreed to stand as vice presidents behind him at the election. And it's not just this unity which is bad news for Erdogan. In late March, the Kurdish HDP party, the largest opposition party outside of the so-called Table of Six, also announced that they wouldn't be fielding a presidential candidate, presumably to avoid splitting the opposition vote. Now, combined, this is why, as things stand, the polls don't look good for Erdogan. Turkey's presidential election system uses a runoff system, which means that if no candidate gets over 50% of the vote in the first round, the top 2 candidates then go through to a runoff election. In this election, there will be 4 candidates in the first round: Erdogan, Kilicdaroglu, and 2 minor opposition candidates. One who represents the Homeland Party, but who used to be a member of the CHP, and another who represents the far-right Ancestral Alliance coalition. At the moment, most polls give Kilicdaroglu a slight lead over Erdogan, but because the anti-Erdogan opposition vote is slightly split between Kilicdaroglu and one of the opposition candidates, a runoff between Erdogan and Kilicdaroglu looks likely. Unfortunately for Erdogan, though, most polls suggest that he would lose this runoff vote. Polls for the parliamentary elections aren't all that much better either. With the exception of an Arada poll from last week, all other recent polls have found that while Erdogan's AKP party might end up as the largest party, they'll probably lose their majority to the opposition bloc. Now, it is too soon to definitely rule Erdogan out of this election. After all, polls in Turkey aren't all that reliable. Erdogan has an uncanny knack for winning elections, and he's beaten Kilicdaroglu at 4 parliamentary elections, 2 presidential elections, and 2 referendums in the past. Nonetheless, as things stand, Kilicdaroglu is the favourite. So, what happens if he wins? How would it change Turkey? Well, to be honest, it's hard to know exactly how Kilicdaroglu would govern. Not least because the Table of Six are an ideologically diverse bunch, including everyone from the centre-left CHP to the right-wing Religious Felicity Party. And all of these groups are only united by their mutual dislike of Erdogan. Now, the coalition did publish a so-called Memorandum of Understanding on Common Policies in late January, but this didn't really include any proper policies. Instead, it was mainly full of what might better be described as political aspirations, like getting inflation down to low single digits, restoring credibility and stability in the Turkish lira, and keeping growth above 5%, without much detail on how any of this is supposed to happen. The coalition's flagship policy proposal, though, involves moving away from the presidential system implemented under Erdogan back towards a more democratic parliamentary system. In practice, this means rolling back the reforms introduced via the 2017 constitutional referendum. So, for example, the new coalition would scrap the president's veto power over new legislation, limit the president's power of decree, and introduce term limits to make sure that no politician could remain in power for more than 7 years. However, while Kilicdaroglu might not be as autocratic as Erdogan, he's not exactly a Western liberal either. Like Erdogan, he wants to send the Syrian refugees back to Syria, and he actually promised to invade Greece at the last election. Now, we should say that in the Memorandum of Understanding on Common Policies, the coalition says that it wants to ditch Erdogan's hawkish foreign policy and improve relations with the EU, with the ultimate aim of joining the EU. Nonetheless, the point we're making here is that while Kilicdaroglu would generally be good news for Turkey-EU relations, the fundamental issues around Greece and Cyprus would probably persist, and his previous statements suggest that he's unlikely to make significant concessions. After all, while Kilicdaroglu is clearly a different proposition to Erdogan, he's unlikely to be able to turn the country round immediately. Clearly then, the people of Turkey have a big choice at the next election. But one smaller, easier decision that you can make is improving your skills and your career prospects with Brilliant.org. That's because while we all know that the promise of AI is that it will make our lives easier, it's very possible that it will make our work lives more difficult, replacing some people and requiring different skills of others. Brilliant, however, is the best way of improving your STEM skills quickly and in a fun way, investing in your own human intelligence. That's because Brilliant has thousands of lessons, from foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, decision-making, and more, with new lessons added monthly. And by the way, these lessons are interactive and engaging, designed around principles of active learning. So there's no boring lectures going on here. That means that by investing just a few minutes every day in lifelong learning, you can improve your skills and feel a real sense of accomplishment. You can try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by clicking the link in the description. Plus, the first 200 people to do so will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. So thanks for your support and for watching TLDR.